Hello, my name's Dr. Justin Coulson, and I have been asked by the Alana and Madeline Foundation to spend some time talking with you about helping kids to help each other to stay safe online. It's kind of like the buddy system. We all need a buddy. We need somebody to watch out for us and help us to not do dumb stuff, especially in the online world. And it's becoming such a big challenge now. I think every second email, every second phone call that I get from parents who are worried about their children relates to technology. How do I get my kids off screens? How do I get them to be wise and sensible about what they're doing? So I want to do a couple of minutes just setting the foundation for why it's a problem. I'm pretty sure you probably know why, but I think that the conversation is incomplete without providing that foundation. And then I want to spend some time focused on suggestions, some things that we can do to help kids, to help each other to stay safe online. Because you know what? They listen to their peers a whole lot more than us. I want to set the scene, though, by talking about some research that comes from Lawrence Steinberg. He's probably the world's leading academic when it comes to research into adolescence. And Lawrence Steinberg has found that if you bring people into the laboratory on their own, whether they're children, whether they're teenagers, whether they're adults, and ask them to participate in a risk-taking game on the computer, everyone plays about the same in terms of the quantity of risks that they take and the size of those risks. If you ask them to bring their best friend, something interesting happens. Kids, they still behave the same way and adults still behave the same way. But once children become teenagers, and I'd say somewhere around about the age of 12 or 13, it all starts to change. They start to take bigger risks and more risks once they know that they've got an audience, somebody's watching them. Now, this is a really important thing to bear in mind when it comes to technology and kids, because very rarely, when kids are doing dumb stuff online, are they doing it in isolation. They tend to do things that aren't helpful, aren't wise, aren't useful for the rest of their lives, whether it's cyberbullying, whether it's sexting, whether it's gambling, or any of the other risky things that we'll talk about shortly. They tend to do these things in concert with other people. Now, it depends on what they're doing as to who that audience actually is, and whether the audience is with them in person while they're doing something online, or whether they're just doing it online towards somebody else. But other people tend to be involved, and I think that that's because of this teenage brain challenge that we're faced with, where their reward pathway, their nucleus accumbens, their amygdala, their limbic system goes bananas when there's somebody near them. They think, I've got an audience, I've got to be cool, I've got to do something awesome, I've got to earn some social capital. So let's talk a little bit about the problems that are exacerbated by this peer pressure, and then we'll talk about how we can turn peer pressure into a force for good rather than a force for more tragedy and disaster that we're seeing far too much. So the first point that I really want to make is a really simple one, and that's this. Our kids are now on a whole lot of platforms, including many that aren't in this picture, and those platforms go with them everywhere. They're now part of the family. And with that comes attendant risks. You know, the more time you spend on the road, the more likely it is that you're going to have a crash. The more time that you spend in certain places, the more likely it is that certain things will happen to you in those places. And when it comes to being online, the more time that you spend online, the greater the risk that something negative might happen. For example, pornography. Now, I think that this is probably the biggest concern that's facing our young people. Pornography is, in the words of some politicians now, a genuine public health concern. And we all know that kids are walking around with pornography in their pockets on a daily basis. Whether they choose to access it or not, well, that's a story for another day. But we also know that teenagers, in particular, the age 14 through 17, are the world's biggest consumers of pornography. And kids' average age of exposure, somewhere around 10 or 11. So they're finding it, and it's affecting their beliefs and their behaviors. Second big issue is privacy. Now, we've been talking about privacy nonstop for years. And when I say we, I mean anyone who's involved in this online world, talking to parents and working with kids on making good decisions, wise decisions online. Privacy is a problem. Kids share their school uniforms, they share their identity, their birthdays, they share so much personal and private information. And in some cases, it can come back to have some very serious consequences. There are massive health problems. I'm not going to spend all day on these health problems, but I think that it's probably fair to say that sleep would be the number one. Obesity would be secondary. And I guess some really interesting research that's come out of the Australian Catholic University. Joseph Cherokee has done some great work there longitudinally that shows that kids who are experiencing negative mental health issues, they tend to not use screens more as a result of those mental health issues. But kids who use screens more in, say, grades 8 and 9 are significantly more likely to have mental health issues in grades 10 and 11. Are screens good or bad? Well, I used to say that I was pretty neutral on it. I used to say that these social media platforms and screens are neither good nor bad, but what we do on them determines how good or bad they are. I'm less inclined to that opinion anymore. When you look at the thousands of software engineers whose job it is to keep our kids addicted, and us as adults, to these screens, and when you look at the way these screens pervade and persist in every aspect of our lives now, I'm inclined to say that screens, while they can be good, just because they can be good doesn't mean that they should be there. There are lots of things in life that can be good, but they also have negative impacts on us, and so it might be better to say no to some of those things. I won't give you any examples. I'll let your imagination go crazy with that yourself. Now, the last risk, I guess, that we need to look at, that kids get themselves into strife with all the time, is bullying. We're going to talk about that a little bit more as we go on, but let's just go back through these ones really quickly. Pornography, consumption, especially when it comes to sexting. While pornography is often consumed alone, girls are more likely to consume it with friends, by the way, more as a, can you believe they did that? Oh, my goodness, it's a sort of a social thing. But when it comes to privacy, when it comes to health, when it comes to bullying, and anything else that you might be worried about, it's usually done with peers. Peers know about it. Peers are involved in it. And so I think we need to look at what's going on here so that we can identify the best way forward and how peers can help each other. There are three basic psychological needs that drive the challenging behavior that we see on screens. Again, I'm not going to spend a long time on this, but this is important foundational information. If you're dealing with anybody who's having a hard time when it comes to screen use, or when it comes to motivation more generally for just about anything, chances are one of these three psychological needs is not being met. It's being thwarted or interrupted in an important way. The first of these psychological needs is competence. I think that kids are on these screens so much and are doing what they're doing so much because the screens make them feel competent. They feel like they're in control. They know what's going on. They know this world and they feel capable, competent, and therefore confident. Secondly, relatedness is a fundamental psychological needs. People are much more motivated to be involved in just about anything when they've got good relationships with people or when they're trying to save a relationship. And that's why I think we have so many of these challenges here in this social space online, because relatedness is at the core of it and it's a fundamental psychological need. The third is autonomy. Kids just want to rule their lives. They want to run their own lives without anyone telling them what to do, and autonomy is central to that. Therefore, these psychological needs are driving a tremendous amount of the challenging behavior that we're seeing. So what can we do? What do we do to help kids make good decisions when they're online? Let me share with you a few ideas about how we can help kids help one another to be safe. The first thing that I want to talk about is this idea of explicit teaching. Now, I think we're usually okay at this, although I'm not going to say that we're great. So explicit teaching isn't, hey kids, get off that social media because I said so. Stop it now, cut it out. It's against our policy. You're not allowed to do that here. We've got this piece of paper on the wall in the library or in the classroom and it says children are not allowed to do X, Y, and Z. That's not explicit teaching. That's just using our power to make kids do stuff. Explicit teaching is when we say something like, let me share with you why we ask you to do that. I wonder, do you have any guesses about why this might be important? See, sometimes the kids get so bored of us saying, this is why we ask you, let me tell you why, and we actually do explain it. They get so over that we start talking and they just go, la, 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 and then they think, oh, gee, she talks so much. Well, he's always got something to say about this. I've heard it 1,000 times. They actually don't even know the answers, but they just know that when you start talking, it's like they've pushed that button on the machine, and they know they're going to get a good 90 seconds where they don't have to think about anything. I mean, you think about it. The more I talk at you, which is unfortunately what webinars are about, the harder it is for you to stay focused on what I'm saying. There's this attention curve, and attention starts really high, woohoo, all the way up there, and then it slowly slides back down the longer somebody talks until they say something really interesting, and our attention is grabbed again and it goes up, but then it slides back down. When it comes to talking to our children or to our students, explicit teaching is important, but they do get a little bit bored, a little bit frustrated. So I would suggest this. Explain the first time, because we need to give them a basic explanation. But perhaps next time you have the conversation, in fact, with older children, you might even start with this, get them to explain it to you. You know, I've asked you a few times to stop doing that. I wonder if you can tell me why it's important that we don't do X, Y, or Z. And so by doing this, they get to explicitly teach you what your rationale is. Whose brain is working while they're doing the talking? I think it's theirs. But whose brain is working while we're doing the talking? Ours, not theirs. Theirs is just going, oh, they're doing it again. Golly, this is boring. Okay, so that's the first thing, explicit teaching. The second suggestion I'm going to make is that we share stories with them. Stories of models and paragons of absolutely great decision making. Let me share an example of that with you just now. So one of my eldest daughters, I've got 6 daughters. I know, 6. I struggle with it myself sometimes. So I've got 6 daughters, and my eldest, one of the eldest kids, was in a group chat on Messenger on something, and there was about 24 people in this group chat, and she was sitting next to one of her friends who was also in the group chat. They were sitting in the living room and they were chatting on their phone with 22 other people. And then I heard my daughter say, oh no. And Laura, her friend, looked at her and said, no, I can't believe they did that. And then she started to cry. Laura started to get really emotional. And she said, what had happened was that one of the boys in this group chat had shared a picture. Now, it wasn't an intimate picture, but it was an embarrassing picture of Laura. Now, Laura had told this boy when he received the picture from her, or when he took the picture of her, you need to delete that. I don't want anybody to see that. That is so embarrassing. That's horrible. And for whatever reason, this boy in this group chat of 24 people decided that he just needed to share that image right then so that everybody could see it. Really unfair, really unkind. And Laura started to get quite upset about it. It really mattered to her. So my daughter pulled out her phone and texted. Let's say that the boy's name was Michael. And she said, Michael, not cool. Laura told you not to share that, and now you've shared it with everybody. You need to delete it, and everybody needs to delete it off their phones. We need to take it down. Laura doesn't want it to be there. Now, that was kind of brave that she did that because everybody else was watching, but she cared about a friend, and she wanted to be, I guess, a rebel. She wanted to rebel against what the rest of the group was cool with. And Laura was saying horrible things. You need to take that down now. You promised you wouldn't. So it was quite a volatile hotbed for these kids. But the boy decided to double down. The boy decided to get really aggressive. And he said, I can share whatever I want. I don't care what she says. I can share it. It doesn't matter. He clearly had no idea of the concept of consent. And so he started to then attack my daughter in addition to attacking Laura, and started to say all kinds of unkind things. Laura removed herself from the conversation. But my daughter said, Michael, you're not getting it. You didn't have her permission to share it. It's not cool. Just let it go. And he started to call her names and started to threaten to share images of her, which he didn't have, but he started to say unkind things to devalue her reputation and her contribution to the group. At that point, my daughter came to me. She said, Dad, what do I do? You've always told me that I'm supposed to help people to make good decisions, and I've done this, and it's not going well, and I'm stressing. Like, she was really upset about it. And I said, well, I think that you probably might just remove yourself from the conversation and let it blow over. There's nothing else I can really suggest. Or you can hope that one of your friends will come to your rescue. And amazingly, about 4 seconds after I said it, the phone went, and one of my daughter's friends had sent a message, Michael, you've overstepped the mark. You've gone too far. That's not cool. And he started to attack her. And then somebody else said, Michael, we're all in agreement. You're doing the wrong thing. See, what happened was it just took one. It took one person to say, stop it. And when he attacked her, somebody came to her rescue, and then somebody else. And pretty soon, Michael was removing the picture and saying, I'm sorry, it wasn't cool. I got it wrong. Now, does it always work out like that? Of course not. But that's a great outcome, and I think that it's worth sharing with the kids. We also do need to let them know and acknowledge that sometimes it doesn't work out, but we need to do what is right. I love the quote from Augustine of Hippo. He said, right is right, even if no one is doing it. Wrong is wrong, even if everyone is doing it. And when we appeal to that moral angle, I think the kids get it. They feel good. They feel elevated. They know that it's right, and they want to do that right thing. So explicit teaching, you might just call it explain. You can do it in a couple of ways. Explain quite clearly why. Oh, I've got to tell you a quick story about that. One of my favorite people at the Alana and Madeline Foundation is Annie. Annie works in the front counter. I always get her title wrong, so I'm just going to say that Annie works, she greets people as they come in the door. She's at the reception desk. She does a wonderful job. And Annie had changed a sign on the door a few months ago, or maybe a year ago, when I visited the Alana and Madeline Foundation. She changed a sign on one of the doors where they pack the buddy bags. And the sign used to say, please keep this, please shut the door. But she changed it. It changed to, please keep this door closed as it helps to regulate the air conditioning. And I said, Annie, I noticed that you've changed the sign. Why did you do that? She shrugged her shoulders and said, nobody ever closed the door. Well, how's compliance now? It's through the roof. Why do you think that? I think it's because people know why I want the door closed. You see, when we explicitly teach, when we explain, when we provide a really clear rationale, why I'm asking you to close the door is because people get it and they're much more likely to comply. Now, if you've said it 1,000 times, like I said, get them to explain it to you. I've talked to you about this before. Why do we have this rule? Get them to explain it to you. And the third thing is share stories of models and paradigms. Okay, the next thing that I think that we can do to help kids be safe is share hypotheticals. This is where we sit down and we say, hey, I heard a story on the news yesterday, or I read an article in the paper, or I was in a staff meeting, or I was talking to a friend who's a teacher at another school. You never want to implicate anybody because everyone knows that you're talking about the kid just there, but you want to share a hypothetical. Here's what happened. What would you do if that happened to you? Get kids to break into groups of 3 or 4, or even groups of 2, small groups. Once you go beyond about 4 or 5, the kids start doing what we call social loafing. That is, 1 or 2 sit back and say, I don't need to say anything. I'm shy. I'm an introvert. They don't feel like they need to include themselves. Somebody else can do all the talking. The other challenge that you have with groups of anything larger than about 4 or 5 is that you get 1 or 2 kids who will always be dominant. And so even kids that have got great things to say might not share. So small groups, give them a hypothetical and get them to maybe write out an answer or get them to talk together about an answer or whatever. You can be as creative as you want. They might do something arty or they might write an essay or whatever you decide. And then once you've gone through that exercise with them, change it up. So you might say, well, what would you do if somebody did that to your friend? Well, what would you do if it was your sister or your brother? What would you do if it was somebody that you didn't know and you just happened to see it online while you were going through your feed? And so by changing it up, they get to imagine the different contexts and identify how different contexts can be associated with different behaviors. The hypotheticals get the children to actually practice what they can do to be morally congruent with their values in a safe environment so that if it does happen in an unsafe environment, they can have a level of confidence. They've already been through this. They're pre-armed. They're ready to go. Okay, the next thing that I think we can do, excuse me, is I think that we can equip them with the words that they need. Oh, by the way, before I get to that, I just want to give you another word for hypotheticals. See, explicit teaching can be condensed down to explain. We explain to them or they explain to us. Hypotheticals, what would you do if? This can be described by the word explore. You see, what I'm walking you through here are what I call the 3 E's of effective discipline. Discipline not as in getting kids in trouble and punishing them, but discipline as in teaching them good ways to act. That's what we're doing here, and that's what discipline really is. Discipline is about teaching and guiding and inspiring. It's not about hurting, it's about helping. And so this is actually a discipline process. It's a teaching process. So we've got explain, which is the explicit teaching. We've got explore, which is the hypotheticals. And then we've got the 3rd E, which I call empower. But I've put here we can equip them with the words that they need. And so we might talk them through this hypothetical and do some explicit teaching. And we might say, well, what do you think is the best way forward? And hear the words that they say. If they're not sure, and younger children will probably struggle, we can say things like, well, you know what you could say. Let's imagine that you're asleep at a sleepover party. In fact, a quick story. This is actually based on reality. Jacob, 9 years old, at a sleepover party with a whole bunch of his friends. And one of the kids says, hey, let's look up some rude words on the iPad. No parents were supervising at the time. It was after dark, or parents had gone to bed and trusted that the kids were going to go to sleep. And so Jacob was in this situation where he'd been taught by his parents. In fact, his parents had pre-armed him. They'd given him a hypothetical before he even showed up at the sleepover. They'd done some explicit teaching and explained their expectations. And then they'd said, Jacob, what would you do if this happened? Let's walk through it. Well, what if this happened? How would you deal with that? And they talked to him about how he could ring them. He had his own device. He could send them a text message and say, I need help. He could do any number of different things that would get him out of the situation. But they also gave him some words that he could use, some sentences that he might share. And a couple of those sentences are really simple, and an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old can use them. I don't think we should do that. Or, I'm really uncomfortable about this. And when a child is willing to say that, they kind of stop the momentum. Now, something even more powerful might be, I don't think we should do that. Do you really? Or I'm really uncomfortable about this. Is anyone else? There is a risk about leaning on the wisdom, the collective wisdom of the group, and that is that if there's too much momentum, if you're not a strong child, the group might override you, and that can be really hard. So I say that one with caution, but it could be interesting. But there's power in helping them to have the words that they need, and they can help each other to do that. Maybe they could say, instead of looking that up and feeling horrible about it, maybe we can look up this instead, and they can have other things that could be fun and funny to look up, things that will entertain them and take them on a different tangent. Or they might even simply have words like, I don't feel right about this. I think that I need to go and call my parents and go home. Now, that's a really tough one, but some kids might have the courage to say that and they're willing to do it. So they're just 3 ideas. I think we could probably talk about this all day, but webinars can be hard to watch, and I think that if I keep on going for too long, you might fall asleep. But let me go through that again really quickly. Explain, explore, empower. They're the 3 E's of effective discipline, the 3 E's of effective teaching and guiding and instructing and inspiring kids to make great choices. I'm really appreciative of the opportunity that I've had to spend some time with you today. Let me share with you a couple of contact details in case I'm interesting to you and you'd like to be in touch. I give keynote talks, I give workshops and facilitate conversations for parents and for staff in schools and organizations right around the country. I do talk a lot about digital issues because obviously parents are worried about them. But I also talk about how to make families happier, how to boost positivity in the workplace. My PhD was in positive psychology and parenting. And I also talk a lot about resilience. I've got a great talk called 9 Ways to a Resilient Child. I do a lot of other work in that area. So if any of this is particularly interesting to you, I'd love for you to get in touch. I've got an email address on the screen. You've also got my Facebook and Twitter. And if you text me, family, to the phone number that you can see on the screen right there, I'd love to have you be part of my free newsletter where I provide you with a whole bunch of useful information like the things that we've talked about today. I want to share one more really, I think, powerful idea before we wrap things up. And hopefully I will hear from you, by the way, but let me share this with you. If you're working in libraries or in schools and you're working with young people, you've heard of a guy called Percy Jackson. My kids love Percy Jackson, and I think he's pretty cool too. And I want to share with you something that happens in Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief. I'm going to take about a minute and share the story with you, and then I want to draw one central point from it. Percy is on a mission to save the world. He's with his 2 friends, Grover and Annabeth, and they've been traveling across the United States from east to west. They're on the way to California. As they get closer to California, they're absolutely exhausted. They're run down, they're completely tired out. And they get to Las Vegas and they stop at the Lotus Hotel and Casino. While they're at the Lotus Hotel and Casino, they're beckoned in and they walk in and they fall in love with what they see. The whole lobby was a giant game room, and I'm not talking about cheesy old Pac-Man games or slot machines. There was an indoor water slide snaking around the glass elevator, which went straight up at least 40 floors. There was a climbing wall on the side of one building and an indoor bungee jumping bridge. There were virtual reality suits with working laser guns and hundreds of video games, each one the size of a widescreen TV. Basically, you name it, this place had it. There were a few other kids playing, but not that many. There was no waiting for any of the games, and there were waitresses and snack bars all around serving every kind of food you can imagine. So Percy, Grover, and Annabeth, they go in, and then something happens. Percy says, I'm not sure when I realized something was wrong. Probably it was when I noticed the guy standing next to me at the VR sharpshooters. He was about 13, I guess, but his clothes were weird. I thought he was some Elvis impersonator's son. He wore bell-bottoms and a red T-shirt with black piping, and his hair was permed and gelled like a New Jersey girl's on homecoming night. We played a game of sharpshooters together, and he said, "Groovy, man. Been here 2 weeks, and the games keep getting better and better." Groovy? Later, while we were talking, I said something rocked, and he looked at me kind of puzzled, as if he'd never heard the word used that way before. He said his name was Darren, but as soon as I started asking him questions, he got bored with me and started to go back to the computer screen. I said, "Hey, Darren." "What? What year is it?" He frowned at me. "In the game?" "No, in real life." He had to think about it. 1977? I started talking to people, and I found it wasn't easy. They were glued to the TV screen or the video game or their food or whatever. I found a guy who told me it was 1985. Another guy told me it was 1993. They all claimed they hadn't been in here very long. A few days, a few weeks at most. They didn't really know, and they didn't really care. Then it occurred to me. How long had I been here? It seemed like only a couple of hours, but was it? I tried to remember why we were here. I found Annabeth still building her city. I'm guessing she was playing Minecraft or something. "Come on," I told her. "We've got to get out of here." No response. I shook her. "Annabeth." She looked up, annoyed. "What?" "We need to leave. This place is a trap. Annabeth, there are people here from 1977. Kids who have never aged. You check in and you stay forever." I love that story because it emphasizes two things. Number one, peers can drag each other down. They get caught up in their world and they drag each other in, just like Darren and all of the other kids who were in there for decades. But it only takes one kid like Percy Jackson to say, "We got to get out of this. This isn't where we should be." And when they hear stories like this about Percy Jackson taking that high ground and being willing to say, "We got to get out of here," buddies can be buddies. They can help each other. They can exert positive peer pressure on one another, and they can make a positive difference. The online screen world can be great, but it can also be a trap. And when we equip our kids by explaining, exploring, and empowering them to be like Percy Jackson, or like my daughter was that time, or like Jacob was at that sleepover party, they make better decisions, they help each other, and they keep each other safe. I hope to hear from you soon. My name's Dr. Justin Coulson. It's been wonderful talking to you. Thank you.